Welcome back to episode 3 of the video lecture series for the upcoming book, Money Chasing Behavior. This is the author, Zach Ox, and in this lecture, we're going to cover the core concepts for chapter 3, which focus on currency. In the last lecture, we covered the distinction between the reality and social layers. Focusing on reality, and in particular physical wealth production, we covered how labor and materials are the real inputs to wealth creation, and how large groups change their labor productivity, and how this productivity is affected by decisions and the exchange rate. We covered how optimal decision-making creates win-win scenarios, and how the emergence of markets and ungrounded prices create win-lose scenarios. We walked through how the optimal decision-making results in the maximal production and received well-being, and how everyone is best off under these conditions. We covered the 4 types of exchange inefficiencies and how these exchange rates make certain individuals worse off and change their labor, and how these inefficient labor decisions make the entire society worse off over time. First off, my apologies for the delay. We've been working on revisions in the campaign, and this lecture in particular needs some extra attention to detail for the visuals and making sure that I'm giving you the best tools to understand a very complicated topic. Everything that we covered in the last lecture dealt with the barter system, and here we are going to see how adding currency to a system changes things. We mentioned the social layer and social constructs, but now we need to focus on them as currencies are social constructs. The use of the term social construct may sound like something philosophers just make up, and in a way this is true, but things that qualify as constructs are incredibly important. While real wealth creation requires real inputs of matter and labor, social constructs are not real and function via the minds that believe in them. Real labor yields different payoffs to well-being based on what labor we decide to do. But social constructs like money influence our decisions because of our collective belief regarding a unit's value. And here we get a sneak peek at the decision-making when income is involved and how this creates money-chasing behavior and how little wealth is created. Borders are a great example of a social construct. Borders are not real. Full stop. There are no Canadian particles on one side and US particles on the other. Borders are merely the belief and recognition of other people's beliefs that people on one spot of land do things a certain way and those in another spot do something different. Laws are the same way, and when you cross to a place with different beliefs about laws, we conform to those agreed upon rules. But these are all in our head. We can alter social constructs at any time simply by believing something different. If people on the West Side collectively agree on certain things and believe that they are done differently in the East, and Easterners believe the same, the borders are magically changed. All social constructs function via our beliefs. Let's think about the involved constructs in a lawsuit. We construct the authority and title for a judge, who gets these powers from our agreed upon government institutions, who hand down a social ruling, which awards someone a number of social units. These fictional constructs, while useful, all function via recognition and agreement by real minds. How well they serve us depends on how they map onto reality. If our tools map onto reality accurately, we get where we want to go. When our tools don't map onto reality, this defeats the purpose. Money is our primary tool for social interaction. So how does money map onto the reality of wealth creation? Well, it's going to depend on the alignment between the social tools and reality. There are 2 versions that we'll need to analyze: low accuracy and high accuracy. Our current systems represent the low accuracy system. These systems are what we can call ungrounded, as there is no direct relationship between reality and the social tools. The high accuracy alternative that this theory requires is a grounded system where there is a direct relationship between reality and the social tools. As current systems are both unaligned and severely overcomplicated, let's start by covering what a grounded system looks like. When we exchange money for something, the amount of money is the cost, and we are going to want this social tool cost to map onto real costs. If we do not map real costs onto the currency, the social tool will be disconnected and inaccurate in relation to real costs. So the question becomes, do we want to map the real costs of matter, labor, or both? Now, we're not going to want a currency to attempt to have properties of both components, as this would be like connecting the amount of aluminum under the Earth's surface to how far you can run in a minute. These do not have a perfectly correlated or causal relationship. So which do we use? Matter, or what we call raw materials or natural resources, is already incompatible with our existing types of uniform currency structures. This is due to no individual type of matter having a direct relationship to all forms of wealth creation, so it would be both impossible and nonsensical to base currency units in matter or materials. These materials have been, and ought to be, tracked by separate means, and the field that focuses on what we can call funds or resource funds is ecological economics. This study is essentially the equivalent of a financial tracking system for materials and the environment, and ecological economics should be taken far more seriously than it currently is, despite remaining separate from the labor component. The first reason for this is the difference in control and impact between materials and labor. We have little control over resources and, in some sense, no control. The natural endowments of our environment are what they are. We don't get to re-roll the development of the universe. We are stuck with the hand that the universe dealt us in terms of resource endowments. Our only control over resources is the rate at which we use and recover them. Remember that once we run out of a non-renewable resource, we can no longer create those items of wealth that rely on that resource. For instance, gold is one form of matter. If the formation of the universe and Earth were different and our gold endowment had either twice as much gold or half as much gold as we have now, this would not mean that we would have twice as much or half as much wealth as we do now. Another key difference between labor and materials and why labor ranks higher in importance is the temporal dimension. Untouched materials tend not to go bad. If we don't extract metals from the planet, they are likely to be there many thousands of years into the future. Labor, on the other hand, is extraordinarily time-sensitive. With materials in a separate accounting system, this leaves us to map our most sensitive cost, labor, onto the currency. Labor as a general quantity is objectively shared between all goods and the individuals who create those goods. If we are to have a system that reflects reality, our interaction tool, being the currency, should reflect the labor cost of creating something. If we abandon objectivity for an arbitrary currency, we will only measure subjective valuations of what individuals believe the currency to be worth, and not the real amount of labor required to create goods. Referring to our logger-fisher scenario, we can visualize this disconnect by adding currency to the same exchanges. If we start with the win-win optimal, where the exchange is 10 fish for 2 logs, 1 hour for 1 hour, we assign the value of $1 to 1 hour. Then the parties can simply exchange $1 for 10 fish or 2 logs. When the fisher changes the exchange rate to 5 fish for 2 logs, this is the equivalent to a price change where 4 logs are priced at $1, or cutting the price in half to 50 cents per labor hour or 2 logs. This is the logger laboring the same amount and receiving less, which in the long run creates labor inefficiencies through the logger changing his occupation, and less wealth is created. In the book and later lectures, we'll go into greater depth as to how we calculate labor quantities, but for the time being, we want to focus on available labor. The quantity of available labor is the amount of labor that we can expend on wealth creation at a given time. So in a labor-based currency, the money supply must map on to how much labor is available. For instance, if our loggers community or society contains 300 laborers who labor 5 hours per day and 6 days per week, this gives us a supply of 9,000 labor hours per week, and is obviously different from traditional currencies. The per week denotes the dimension of time. We've hinted at labor being time sensitive. Here's why. Let's suppose that we create 9,000 labor hour units per week to give this society a currency supply that reflects their available labor. Let's also suppose that they only expend 3,000 labor hours each week and save 6,000 units. The real 6,000 unused labor hours are lost and wasted. If we didn't labor yesterday, we don't get to go back and use that labor later. It's gone. When the next week cycles over, there's an additional 9,000 labor hours added to reflect the new amount of available labor. Without a temporal dimension to the currency where used currency is either destroyed or cycled over, the supply becomes 15,000 in the second week, 21,000 in the third week, 27,000 in the fourth week, and so on. While there are logical workarounds for more minor adjustments to the supply, this currency is broken as one unit of the social tool no longer represents one labor hour in reality. This is what we can call currency discordance. For the community, the amount of available labor to produce fish, logs, berries, and the other goods will remain the same. But the amount of currency available for expenditure is now 15,000 in the second week. It is impossible to produce 15,000 hours of goods when the production capacity is only 9,000 labor hours per week. If each fish really costs 10 cents or 1/10 of a labor hour, allowing the price to disconnect from the true cost of 0.1 hours per fish defeats the purpose of the currency, as the proportionally inflated price rises to 16 cents. This is equivalent to spending more hours than were actually labored, and the currency is discordant. In an attempt to avoid this disconnect and keep the costs accurate, the currency will run into the second problem. The society would be limited to spending only 9,000 hours per week, thus rendering the remaining 6,000 units as unspendable. And what good is a currency that we cannot spend? To properly account for labor's dimension of time, a currency that reflects reality must have an expiration date. The purpose of the currency having this characteristic is to match the social units to the real labor in the economy. So every unit reflects a real labor hour. In a later lecture, we'll cover how the length of the expiration date is semi-arbitrary and can be adjusted for further optimization, and how these units cycle over. Now, we might be tempted to say, forget adding 9,000 new units every week and just allow the 9,000 in circulation to represent the available labor. But this makes an expiration date impossible to implement and abandons the connection to labor's temporal dimension. The problem with static money or currency supplies, like those we currently use, is arbitrary velocity. Velocity, or the velocity of money, is the rate of exchange or number of times that money changes hands over a period of time. Because we want the currency to reflect labor in the temporal dimension, we want to have a very specific velocity where available labor matches both currency and labor expenditures. This is the inflow of new currency matching the rate at which labor is put to use and old units are cycled over into new units. In a concordant system, this rate looks like the edge of a knife. And for this theoretical economy, the rate is 9,000 units or labor hours per week. The optimal velocity is equal to what we can call the maximal velocity. We can reach a maximal velocity when we use all available labor, and these labor expenditures match the currency spending. Anything faster or slower than this rate is an inefficiency. If the velocity is low or slower than the maximal velocity, there is labor not being put to use, meaning that labor is lost permanently. If the velocity is higher or faster than the maximal, this means that labor is devalued as more units are exchanging for the same amount of labor, hence the name maximal velocity. Despite the appearance of a knife's edge, this is not much of a concern for a system with an expiration-dated currency, as the impending expiration ensures that the currency is spent by a specific time. The more precise an expiration date, the easier it is to guarantee reaching maximal velocity within a system. As we'll cover in detail in a later lecture, this maximal velocity is going to grant us a nice controlled deflation, meaning that each unit will purchase more wealth over time. But we also won't need to be concerned about the deflationary spiral that economists worry about in ungrounded systems. So I know we've covered the basics for a whole new system fairly quickly, but we want to get to how current systems function. If you need to pause and go back, now is a good time. To understand how our current systems function, why they are ungrounded, and why they are severely overcomplicated, first we need to understand the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money, or QTM, gives us the equation of exchange for the relationship between money and goods. This equation is simply an observation of how our systems work and is not a prescription of what we ought to do regarding any one variable. There are also two primary versions of the equation, with this lecture focusing on the more common version. M stands for the money supply, V stands for the velocity of money, P is the price of goods, and Q is the quantity of goods. And as we'll notice, Q is the only variable that pertains to the reality layer and is the wealth output, not the costs of matter and labor. Let's start on the left side of the equation with the money supply. Remember that money, or technically speaking currency, is simply a social tool for trade interactions. The money supply in the broadest context is how many of these tools exist to facilitate trade interactions. So the real money supply will include all viable units for exchange. Current systems are severely overcomplicated as the viable supply depends on what is accepted in a transaction. For instance, the viable money supply can be different from vendor to vendor depending on whether they do or do not accept cash, credit, foreign, crypto, etc. So the real or functional supply is not just your domestic fiat currency, but any form of currency acceptable in an exchange. This is then further complicated by the ease of exchange between different types of currency, which will determine our ability to have the appropriate currency type for the exchange we want. This broad or functional money supply sits up in the ether with our other social constructs. While many of these currencies are real and exist in reality, the value we attribute to them is purely social, as they are not grounded in the objective costs of wealth creation. For instance, there is little real difference between a US $100 bill and a $100 Hasbro Monopoly note. These are both real, physical objects, but we socially construct meaning or value around the US $100 bill, as we all agree that this object means something when we interact. Because of the ungrounded relationship to wealth creation, this contemporary money supply has no explicit temporal dimension, so units are not removed and replaced. And this makes the money supply function like a pool where units simply change hands over and over. And this creates the zero-sum type interactions where we contest over the supply. Apart from any potential asymmetries when we add new units to circulation, for you to gain $1 is for someone else to lose $1. If we think of wealth as a pizza and pieces of a measuring stick as currency for the pizza, the measuring stick as a whole is the money supply. If we increase the money supply and go from using a ruler to a yardstick, the units have certainly changed, but the amount of pizza they can purchase remains the same. The real wealth or amount of pizza can also change, but the amount of social units exists relative to the pie at all times. Now, how these units circulate brings us to velocity. Unlike the grounded system where velocity exists at a set rate to ensure the money supply's relationship to the cost of labor, in QTM we should think of velocity as part of the money supply. In this case, velocity is quite literally a money multiplier. If the money supply is $5 billion and the average velocity is 3 exchanges per year, we can have the same effect with a supply of $3 billion and a velocity of 5 exchanges. Unlike the grounded system where each unit represents a real unit of labor, in QTM, the individual units of a currency represent multiple interactions, as they are quite literally spent multiple times. Because velocity is an average, this creates further disconnect from the grounded unit to reality relationship, as each unit has a different velocity. When someone stores their money under a mattress, those units have no velocity as they are not spent. When a digital dollar hops around dozens of accounts a day in high-frequency trading, that unit has a very high velocity. Although we should note that the version of QTM we are focusing on ignores this type of exchange. This creates a problem of double counting items that are not new but are changing hands over and over while being exchanged for money. GDP calculations, while being a terrible way of measuring production, gets around this by only counting newly produced goods. The problem is that in this version of QTM, velocity is calculated by dividing nominal GDP by the money supply. So the velocity as used here is not the real velocity, because this does not include all of the exchanges where money changes hands for pre-existing goods. The problem again is that each ungrounded unit has its own velocity. Under one condition, a dollar has a velocity of 1 exchange per month and is spent on a pie that costs $1. At the same time, another dollar could have a velocity of 5 exchanges per month and purchase 5 pies. Here the average velocity would be 3 exchanges per month, but this average would say nothing about any given dollar. If all dollars are equal units, this means that the first dollar could also purchase 5 pies. If there are only those 6 pies produced per month but enough value to purchase 10 or more pies when velocity increases, the ungrounded system raises prices to absorb more units. And this is not a good thing with an ungrounded currency. So what is a price? Prices are purely social. They are a nominal amount of social units stating a willingness to exchange. When a seller and buyer are both willing to meet at a price, an exchange occurs. As an agreed upon price is purely up to the participating individuals, the number of social units is completely ungrounded. Cost, on the other hand, is something we've already covered, the real inputs required to produce a good. Cost is objective. On the next slide is a very simple comprehension question regarding cost. I'll give you a few seconds before giving the answer because we don't want to overthink this. So, what is the objective cost of creating a house? And here we are not thinking of any specific house. This answer should apply to any house. Answer: the materials that comprise the house and the labor required to manipulate those materials into the final house are the real costs. The answer cannot be money, full stop. If the objective cost of a house were money, this would entail that it is impossible to create a house without money, which of course is not true. The real cost of building a house is covered the moment that house is completed. All other costs in the normal sense, like mortgage payments, are really just social relationships that continue unrelated to reality. If you buy a house and pay a mortgage over 30 years, the real costs were paid before you ever owned the house, and now you are making purely social payments in relation to ownership rights, which are another type of social construct. So let's wrap up price with the discussion as a whole. Here we have two types of systems. Let's start with the grounded side so prices on the left make more sense. And let's first change the money supply to the dollar signs so we don't have two different uses of M. We are using Q equals M plus L to keep the sides consistent, but in real calculations, this is really creation equals matter plus manipulation that we can denote as omega, and the manipulation capacity is the combination of labor and tools. The socially constructed units are human fictions, but here they align with the real labor we wish to measure. Here we also note that velocity is part of the currency unit and has a fixed rate to match the real rate of labor added to the system. Despite matter being tracked by a separate accounting system in terms of how we are depleting the resources, denoted by minus M, matter also comes at the cost of labor required for extracting the materials for use. The created goods then balance the equation by coming at the total cost of labor expended and materials extracted. So the major takeaway, all real costs of real products are perfectly represented by the social construct of the labor-based currency. Our transaction tools align with real costs. Think about this cost relationship because after we wrap up the ungrounded side, I'll ask a question about this and you'll have a chance to win a free copy of the book. For the ungrounded system, let's start with the units. This money supply, or number of total units, has no direct relationship to reality, apart from the real cost to produce a unit. As the use value of each unit does not map onto something real, the quantity, for the purposes of this discussion, is arbitrary. If we were to double everyone's units overnight, all prices would simply double as the total unit quantity means nothing to the underlying reality. Velocity has no determined rate or direct relationship to reality and acts as a multiplier for the money supply. This is again because the money supply and individual units have no direct relationship to reality, so we spend these units over and over, and this velocity simply changes the effective money supply by being a money multiplier. This brings us to price. Price gets us into a bad position as price is determined by human minds. This is a pure willingness to exchange at an arbitrary number of units. So how do these map onto real costs? First, labor price is ungrounded as this is merely the willingness to trade your labor for money at any agreed upon rate. Material prices are also based on willingness to exchange and are only socially limited by a budget and the price of labor to extract them, which is again based on willingness. For the ecological fund, if there are no regional policies for tracking and managing the resource supply, the depletion of resources is limited only by the extraction efficiency and the willingness to sell and expend labor. Belief and willingness are inherently tied to all currencies, as all currencies are social constructs. The problem is that prices based on willingness determine varying instances and degrees of purchasing power. And purchasing power is a social reinforcement of the subjective value of your units. This relationship means that willingness is the grounding value for these ungrounded currencies, because willingness determines if a transaction occurs. If the rest of society doesn't value your units very highly, they transact for less of the pie. This leads to the perceived value of any given currency type to have an unstable relationship with the pie, again on top of being ungrounded to start with. We don't want our currencies standing on shaky legs. If you haven't heard of tulip mania, go look it up. It is for this same reason that the value of all future ungrounded currencies will depend on the perceived and believed value. When we combine all social units, meaning the true money supply, this total quantity exists in a proportional relationship to the real products. And it is this difference in purchasing power, or the exchange rate between currency types, that determines the perceived and believed value of any given unit. And we could rephrase this as the individual unit's perceived value determining the slice of the pie that it exchanges for. So if we want to try predicting the future, whether any currently low value currency becomes more successful, like a cryptocurrency, will depend on its perceived worth to those transacting with it. And the adoption will be socially affected by constraints like ease of use. This is general or functional speak, as this is not technically the case for every type of crypto unit. Some have very different social relationships due to grounding attempts, and gold gets a little quirky as well. So perhaps we'll do a standalone video about gold and crypto analysis. And if this episode in the series gets 500 views and 100 likes, then I'll just automatically bump that up to the front of the priorities and release list. Again, an ungrounded currency means that a change in the unit quantity has no impact on the size of the pie. And a change in the size of the pie has no impact on the number of units. Our current system managers often enact interventions or policies to make such adjustments, but the principal relationship necessitates nothing. This is again because we could instantly double everyone's units and the size of the pie would not change. Whereas in the grounded system, the pie has its intrinsic relationship to the real costs, and apart from the ecological fund for resource tracking, the costs are perfectly reflected in the currency. So the wealth items are in an objective, grounded relationship with both the real costs of production and the representation of real costs in the currency. This grounding would keep the logger and fisher in the win-win cooperative interactions as the units reflect the real labor input, and the unit exchange maintains the relationship. Whereas in the ungrounded currency, when the fisher changes the exchange rate to 5 fish for 2 logs, having the price to 50 cents per labor hour or 2 logs, the logger's decreased price corresponds to his labor, which will change over time, thus creating the inefficiencies in labor expenditures, which then makes everyone worse off. I know this lecture is covering a lot of difficult relationships, and they are going to feel very foreign to how our current systems function. In the next lecture, we'll focus on some more realistic applications and examples that make things more clear. Hopefully this lecture helped provide some general relationship understanding to why our systems are so disconnected from reality. But if you found this too difficult, look for the real examples in the next lecture, and then return here and see if this becomes a little easier to grasp. There we'll cover some examples of how these relationships cause our supply and demand models to break down, and we'll get to the namesake of the book and discuss money-chasing behavior. Speaking of, we have a book to give away. Just listen for now as the instructions will appear on screen. The signed free copy will go to the first correct comment to the following 2-part question. As some of you will have noticed, the grounded system mirrors cost while our current units relate to price. So does this mean that prices are logically prohibited in this system? No, not at all. So the question is, if prices can differ from the objective costs, Part 1, what is the logical necessary relationship between the number of cost units and the willingness-determined number of price units? Meaning that if the quantities are different, how do they need to be related? And as these are not easy questions, we have a big hint on the right. In a grounded system, this is what all receipts and price tags must logically contain for tracking purposes. The cost is X and the price is either also X or it is some other amount Y. Think about Y's relationship to X and what it must be, and we'll want to focus on the logger-fisher mistake to answer this. And part 2, if price and cost are different amounts, how does this difference affect individual units? And the hint for part 2 is, think about how these grounded units map onto reality. How does the real relationship affect what happens to the individual units? All units function under the same logic, so when price differs from cost, think of how and why some units must behave differently to maintain the same logical principle. To submit your answer, type in the comments section of this YouTube video, label this as answer 1 : and then put your answer, and then new line, repeat with answer 2 : and the second part. I will message the winner through YouTube unless you leave your Twitter handle, and we will discuss the answer in full when we get to part 2 of the book. Okay, well, we covered a ton of material in this chapter, so we will skip the full book spiel and just note that we are 1/3 of the way on the pre-sale campaign. The link is in the description. A big thank you to all of those who have pre-ordered and shared content to spread the word. Keep it up, and I will see you next time for one of the most fascinating failures of our current system. Thanks for watching.